Hi, I'm Lori Wallach, the Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. Welcome to our Q&A session as part of our Expose the TPP website launch. Thank you everyone for joining. I've gotten a bunch of interesting questions, which I'm looking forward to answering, and keep them coming, keep the questions coming. But I'm going to start just with a little bit of an overview first of what the TPP is, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's an agreement that President Bush negotiated for a year, starting in 2008. President Obama has been negotiating it now for over 3.5 years. There have been 17 rounds of negotiations, sessions of negotiations. It is an agreement that really is not mainly about trade. There are now 29 chapters of this agreement. It has only 5 chapters of those 29 that are actually about trade. The other chapters set binding international rules limiting things like environmental protections or food safety protections, trampling on our internet freedoms. The copyright chapter has a chunk of the old SOPA, the Stop Online Piracy Act, stuck into it. There are extensions of medicine patents and other new rights for big pharmaceutical companies that could jack up our medicine prices here, but cut off access and kill people in developing countries for not having access to generics. There's even a ban in there on Buy America, Buy Local, Buy Green procurement, which is pretty crazy to have in a trade agreement. And perhaps the scariest thing, it includes an expanded version of the investor state enforcement system for investor privileges. So those are the rules that actually were in the guts of NAFTA in a smaller version that promote offshoring. Those rules make it really safe for a U.S. company to move to a lower cost venue. Of the 11 countries in TPP, one of them is Vietnam. Vietnam's a lower cost venue for offshoring of jobs than, say, China. China's salaries are more or less in the range to $5 to $7 a day. Vietnam's is around $4. Obviously, that's a day, not an hour. So either way, it's bad. Vietnam is the race to the bottom next venue of choice. The investment rules make it really safe, removing most of the risks of taking off, and actually outrageously allow foreign corporations to directly sue national governments in international tribunals to collect taxpayer compensation for any domestic policy that the corporation thinks undermines their new investor privileges, which includes, for instance, no changes in domestic policy that could undermine their expected future profits. Sounds crazy, but it's true. That's one of the few texts that's leaked. This whole process has been super secretive. There have been a few texts that have leaked, and people like me go chasing around the negotiations trying to pick up the tidbits in the hallways. Unfortunately, there's 600 U.S. corporate advisors who are security cleared, are official advisors to the process. And so if you think about the math, it's not a total shocker that this agreement is coming out to be NAFTA on steroids with the world, a real corporate power tool. Totally disappointing. Very different from what President Obama promised us in 2008 when he said renegotiate NAFTA and never do another agreement like that. So TPP was supposed to be signed, according to President Obama, in October of this year, which I know is stunning given Congress has never seen it, and neither of you. The key provision in TPP is every signatory shall ensure the conformity of all domestic laws, regulations, and administrative procedures. We have to change all of our domestic laws to meet these retrograde rules. So when folks have described this as a really subtle, slow-motion coup d'etat against democracy, they're not really exaggerating. So the good news is there is opposition rising in a lot of countries. Totally lunatic things are in there, like financial deregulation, as well as those corporate tribunals. And enough countries have really drawn some lines that if we get campaigns going in each of the TPP countries, just like in the past with these crazy corporate power grabs branded as trade agreements, we can make sure this one doesn't become NAFTA on steroids for the world. We can stop it. And one thing in the U.S. I want to talk about, hopefully someone asks me a question about it, is fast track. That arcane Nixon-era legislative luge run, a procedure so rotten it is the only way NAFTA and WTO got through Congress. It handcuffs Congress zooms trade agreements that Congress never even gets to sign before to vote on before they're signed through Congress. And President Obama, not shockingly, is going to ask for fast-track procedure, a constitutional busting procedure. Our brothers and sisters on the conservative, middle, and left part of the political spectrums can all love to hate. He's going to ask for that to get TPP through Congress. And that is something where actually, as has happened in the past, Democrats and Republicans get together and decide to actually preserve Congress's authority and preserve the Constitution. So with that, I'm going to start with some questions. I'm having one handed to me right now. Why won't the negotiators release the text? Why can't we make them through FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act? It's a really good question. So the Freedom of Information Act, something Public Citizen, where I work, helped actually get established and then opened up so that any citizen can have the right to get any document from the government. FOIA's got a couple exceptions. One of those exceptions is for national security. We have tried to FOIA every trade agreement, every trade document, everything relating to these negotiations for a long time. And what the government says with enormous audacity and not a lot of veracity is there would be a national security violation if they release these agreements. They claim the national security exception. We have litigated this question, actually, with respect to a previous agreement. And unfortunately, the courts have given enormous deference to the executive branch, claiming it's a national security issue. Now, here's the thing that really is ridiculous. They say the other countries would lose confidence in us, and it could undermine our international relations if people here actually got to see the text. But then what about the 600 corporate advisors, for instance? I mean, it doesn't cut it. But right now we're jammed in the courts. So in fact, FOIA ain't going to do it. We've tried it. What will get that text out is all of you actually implementing what we call the Dracula strategy. You must drag this critter out into the sunshine, because in the sunshine, like Dracula, it just does not do very well. How do we do this? We have a great campaign here at Public Citizen where you basically ask your member of Congress for a copy of the text. Because but for the ones who are really, really mad about this, and that's a growing number, most of them don't know they're being rolled. Most of them don't even know, wait, he's going to sign this thing in October? I've never seen it. It's going to rewrite Granny's prescriptions and food safety and ban Buy America and offshore jobs. It's going to do what? So if you write a letter and you go to our Action Center on tradewatch.org, the companion website to expose the TPP, you can go to our action alerts and there's a letter, boilerplate letter there, and it basically has you write to your House member and both senators and say, hi, the Constitution gives you exclusive authority over trade. I hear the president's going to sign a great big trade agreement in October. Could you send me the text? I'm sure you have it. After all, you're the member of Congress who has authority. It's at that point that they realize, I don't have the text. That is actually a really good campaign of inquiry strategy. It is the best way to try and create the pressure on the executive branch to knock off the obnoxious secrecy, which, by the way, is unprecedented. Because just FYI, the last time there was a really big one of these trade agreements, which was the Free Trade Area of the Americas, the official text was released by all the governments in 2001, 3 years into the negotiations. So this is totally unacceptable. We have to turn up the heat. Unfortunately, FOIA isn't going to do it for us. Next question. I'm on Medicare. How would the TPP impact the price of my medications? From someone in Detroit, Michigan. So that's a really good question. So one of the provisions, one of the chapters in this agreement, which I'm very sad to tell you was proposed by the U.S., would actually allow the big pharmaceutical companies to both have a seat at the table in deciding what are called medicine formularies. So a medicine formulary is a list of meds that is typically the only meds that a government program like Medicaid or Medicare will reimburse. They buy them bulk, they get a bargain price. And all the national healthcare systems in countries like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, they're in TPP, they buy all the meds for their countries. So under the system, doctors, pharmacologists get together and they say, all right, we got to have the best drugs for, pick your issue, high blood pressure. Here are a bunch of really good medicines, and they're generic, so we can afford more of them and get them to everyone. Now here comes a new drug, and the big pharmaceutical company wants us to put that on the list and start paying for it. Can they show us it's more effective, it's better for people, it's quicker? Can they show us there's less side effects? If they can't show that, smart, they just stick with the cheaper generic drugs, that's just as good. So there's a push in the TPP in this proposal that perversely is called transparency. That seriously is the name of this chapter. That provides transparency for pharmaceutical giants to sit in on the decisions of the doctors and the pharmacists and have a vote about whether or not their new sky-high priced, brand name, patented monopoly drug should also be reimbursed. What does it mean practically? It also would involve a challenge right if a drug is denied or a price is set they don't like. So practically what it means is folks on Medicare, folks on Medicaid, and the national health care systems in the other countries could see a scenario where those systems could not afford as many medications, as much medication, especially, you know, if you're on meds and you're under one of these programs, the TPP is a threat to you being able to have the meds you need without having to pay a lot and being able to have the meds you need. But in addition, if you aren't worried about that, and by the way, it also affects the veterans programs, but if you're just not worried about that and you care about the debt, the number one driver of our budget deficit in this country is healthcare costs. So just assume you are incredibly healthy, never intend to ever need a piece of medicine in your entire life, but you're nuts about the debt. This is a serious dang problem for you. So this is an issue where this particular chapter just has got to go. Happily, a couple of the countries have said no so far. So I would say get the word out to your congressperson, write a letter just like the question you said. I have medications that I need on Medicare. I'm against TPP because it's going to raise my medicine prices. Send me the text. Ask them to send you the text. Here's the next question. From Matthew in Australia via Twitter. Why doesn't the TPP respect the World Health Organization Framework Convention on Tobacco Control and measures such as plain packets? So what Matthew is referencing is those foreign tribunals I mentioned. So under a different agreement that Australia is in with Hong Kong, those same kind of tribunals and crazy corporate rights exist. So Philip Morris Corporation is suing the government of Australia, the people of Australia, for their taxpayer monies, claiming that Australia's implementation of a World Health Organization treaty on health, on public health, that's about tobacco control, and includes things like warning labels and plain packaging. So instead of all the like attractive, cool, brandy, colory stuff, you just have white packaging with like 14 point font that says Marlboro, and that's all you can see. And so Australia's adopted that, Uruguay's adopted that, a variety of countries have. It's extremely effective. So in comes Philip Morris. International Treaty on Health, domestic law, and in the case of Australia, a domestic law that has been upheld by their Supreme Court. We're going to get rid of that using the investor state tribunal system, the investor rights. So they are right now before a World Bank tribunal trying to attack Australia's right to protect public health, implement its United Nations health treaties, and they intend to extract hundreds of millions of dollars from the Australian taxpayers for a democratic law approved by the Supreme Court of Australia. So why doesn't the TPP respect? I would suspect, Matthew, that the main reason is because the folks who are writing the rules include all the major tobacco firms who are on the advisory committees as compared to the consumer and health groups who are not. Why the Obama administration is going for this is pretty heartbreaking. What is fast track and what does it have to do with the TPP? Also from someone in Detroit, Michigan. So fast track practically is a procedure. It's a procedure for how the Congress and the executive branch deal with trade agreements. So everyone knows about the Boston Tea Party, and I jokingly call what's in our Constitution, that's a big separation of powers on trade, the Boston Tea Party hangover clause. Our country basically got started in a trade war. The King of England decided that he was going to put big taxes, tariffs, border taxes, on tea to fund his wars in Spain and France. So the colonists said, wait, that's not in our interest. That's like for his foreign entanglements. And you all know the history that ensues. So when the founders were putting together the Constitution, they explicitly said, we want control over the substance of trade in the body closest to the people, Congress. We do not want the body like the king having control of this area. So Congress has had exclusive authority in the Constitution, Article 1A, to overtrade the substance. Now, over time, of course, they have to figure out a way to coordinate with the executive branch because the executive branch has the foreign policy authority to negotiate with other countries. So I just wrote a book about this. It's just a totally exciting read, not for those who are prone to nightmares, kind of scary story, but I really recommend you get on our website, fasttrackhistory.org, and buy a copy. And you can download it if you prefer. But the summary of the entire history of trade authority of the United States is, for a very long time, Congress kept a really tight control over it. And then in 1974, just to skip 200 years, of Congress in charge, the executive branch doing what they said, Richard Nixon thought, this is an interesting opportunity to, shocking, grab some of Congress's power. And actually, not just over trade, but over the right to set our legislation. So this is what Fast Track does. In one lump sum, the executive branch simply, if Fast Track is ever in place, simply has to give notice 90 days before it intends to start a negotiation. The executive branch picks the country by themselves. Congress has no way to veto, no say on it. They set the content of the agreement and they negotiate the whole thing. They sign the agreement with the contents they've unilaterally determined before Congress votes. Then they are able to write legislation. Yes, the executive branch, not Congress, writing legislation. And Congress doesn't have any of the normal procedures. So it doesn't even go through the committees to get amended to like Congress likes. This is really written by the executive branch. It gets immediately dropped into the floor, into the hopper for a vote. In 60 days in the House, 30 extra days in the Senate, guaranteed vote. The White House takes over the floor schedule of the United States Congress, which for the constitutional scholars over there is not just an Article 1.8 problem, that is an Article 1.5 problem, which says that Congress, each session, each body sets its own rules and procedures. And then they guarantee no amendments, 20 hours of debate, yes or no vote on this thing that they never had anything to do about, never had any moment to have any content control over. So one sort of wiseacre calls Fast Track a legislative laxative that is bad for the U.S. Constitution. This is an accurate description, but it's also really bad for us. It's Fast Track that made possible some of the worst agreements we've ever gotten into. Since '74, we have had literally hundreds of trade agreements. Only 16 required Fast Track. That's NAFTA, that's WTO, that's CAFTA. The ones that are like skunks at the picnic that could not get through the Congress without some kind of legislative handcuffs are the ones that get Fast Track. So it's always a really good indication that something is rotten, rotten, rotten when the president says, I've got to have Fast Track to finish this agreement. So if we ever wondered if TPP was really, really, really bad news, the fact that President Obama is actually going back on his 2008 promise to replace Fast Track and says he wants the congressional handcuffs to ram this thing through, it's a real heads up. But that's the link. I would say it's very hard for an agreement like TPP to get through Congress without this kind of outrageous procedure. If Congress actually got to really debate it, if Congress maintains constitutional authority, hard go. And by the way, Congress has said no to this kind of shenanigan before. In 1998, when President Clinton asked for Fast Track, 171 House Democrats were joined by 71 Republican members of the House to say no. And basically, their thinking, which those guys never agreed on anything back then either, their thinking was basically on two levels. One, a lot of them were looking just procedurally, this is Congress's authority. We can't have the executive branch just unilaterally writing laws. It's like diplomatically legislating under the cover of so-called trade negotiations. Except these are agreements that rewrite immigration policy, food safety policy, medicine policy, I mean the most domestic issues, financial regulation. And then there are a bunch of people who basically said, this is actually a process that's just outdated. When Nixon cooked this up, like they weren't original folks who didn't like Fast Track. They said, oh, when Nixon did this, our trade agreement was about tariffs. So maybe it was appropriate back then. But, you know, I wouldn't have opposed it back then. But now our trade agreement is about all this domestic business of Congress and state legislatures. It is inappropriate for the situation we've now arrived to. And so the combination stopped it cold, and we can do that again. Next question is, I'm a dairy farmer. What would the TPP mean for me and my farm? Well, I am from northern Wisconsin, central Wisconsin, so hello to the dairy farmers. I spent many a summer on my grandpa's dairy farm. The TPP commercially, so I said there were 5 chapters about trade, 24 chapters about other stuff. The 5 chapters that are about trade include one that's called market access for goods. And one of the most contested issues in that chapter has to do with New Zealand wanting to be able to get access into the U.S. market for mainly powdered and milk concentrates, powdered milk and milk concentrate proteins. These are byproducts of milk, not liquid milk, for their huge conglomerate, which there's in New Zealand. Everyone thinks of sheep and lambs. Well, having been there a couple of times recently, it's all dairy cows, actually with serious environmental hazard because they pack them out in the pasture at real density. It's warm generally year-round. There are no barns. They've got basically like big feedlot operations, only outside next to all the rivers. So these dairy operations have had a government operation that's been recently privatized. Some people still think it's sort of government connected. It's huge. It's called Fonterra. It's the one entity that buys all the milk from all the farmers in New Zealand, and it exports 85% of all of that. It is, for a tiny little country, the biggest dumper of milk around the world. So, to give, and I bet the dairy farmer knows this, but to give everyone else an understanding, I just gave that background. So this is the kind of deal which is disgusting. Get ready, I'll grasp through your barf bucket. This is what the administration has in mind. They actually want to trade, for instance, allowing all that New Zealand dairy to come in here and wipe out our small farmers in exchange for New Zealand giving up their national health care cheaper medicines policy to those review boards that our friend who had asked about the Medicare program was just briefed on. So that would be the trade-off. Higher medicine prices for New Zealanders to get the U.S. to get something for big pharma here in exchange for New Zealand's big agribusiness being able to wipe out farmers here. It's something really worth looking at. Talk to your member of Congress on each of these issues. Whatever is the issue in this agreement that is a serious problem for you personally, you just need to get with your member of Congress about it. And for what it's worth, there are quite a few members of Congress who are involved in the dairy sector who are quite concerned about this. So you've got some leverage there. And the next question is from Sherry in Florida. What kind of effect is the international pushback against the TPP having? Are we making a difference? And the answer is yes. There is a big international pushback against the TPP. Once folks are off this Q&A section, just try Googling TPP in quotes, protest in quotes, and go to image or video, and you will get a lot of great heartwarming pictures, not the least of which are from 5 days ago in Peru, in Lima, which is the last round of negotiations. You basically cannot underestimate the ability of a few very dedicated protesters to get the public aware of an issue. So there are two different things that protests have done in the global pushback. One, in a lot of different countries, they put the governments in the country on notice that people are learning what's going on. It helps other people learn, by the way, because it helps get the word out within the media, etc. But in addition, it lets the governments know, I'm going to be in really serious political trouble if I give away whatever it is. So it is that kind of warning where, you know, if the U.S. is doing the bag work for big pharma, but the government in New Zealand knows, dairy exports or not, if they give away the national health care system's affordable medicines, they're going to have every granny chasing them right out of Parliament indefinitely with a purse to bat them over the head on the way out. So if there is that level of, and I'm painting a funny image, but you know, in a lot of the developing countries, it's a matter of social unrest. Like if in some of these countries, for instance, access to medicine was denied, so that people with AIDS and HIV and malaria and tuberculosis are given a death sentence, not an exaggeration, by TPP. Or with the investor state tribunals, if it's a matter of life or death, you can have water or not. You can have toxic spewing on your kids from some mine or not. You can have control what's going on in your own community or not. These are the kind of issues that if a government sees there's a level of potential social unrest or just political accountability, maybe at the ballot box, that's what a protest indicates. And it also helps educate everyone else so that you can create the dynamics of having that kind of accountability. The second thing that's important with the protests is actually the psychology of the negotiations. So these negotiations happen in a bubble. So for instance, at the Melbourne round of TPP negotiations in Australia, there wasn't like a big rally like there just was in Peru or there has been in Dallas and in Virginia and in San Diego and different places, New Zealand, in Auckland. There were a handful, literally 6, Occupy Melbourne activists. And these guys were so persistent with their great big puppet, they would not let the most annoying negotiators on the most annoying issues literally like go get breakfast without showing up in the window, sort of like, you kill babies, you actually will keep babies not having medication for HIV. And literally the signs were things like AZT patented this amount, AZT generic, you will doom babies in Vietnam to dying from HIV AIDS if you do not back off. Any place they went, these guys were on their case. It was very effective. It made the negotiators nuts. I suspect that it made them less likely to beat on the heads of the other countries to do the wrong thing. So it does have an effect. And also, just proof in the pudding, TPP was supposed to be signed 2 years ago. There have been 2 major deadlines passed, one kind of squishy one. And if I was a betting woman, I would say they're not going to make the end of this year, though they sure as heck are going to try. But they won't if we all work on it. Next question. Before that, we have 30 minutes left, and I bet now it's like 23. And please send in your questions, because otherwise I'll just filibuster like a senator. Here's the next question. Jason, in Philadelphia, what are the fundamental differences between the TPP and U.S. law in regard to the treatment of patents? That is a really interesting question. So part of what we are trying to do with TPP is to try and push out our patent system, which gives fairly extraordinary rights to the big brand name pharmaceutical companies, to the rest of the world. So there are some things that are in TPP, in the U.S. proposals, because again it's draft text still, that are different than U.S. law. But as a general matter, the U.S. strategy is to try and get all the other countries to basically suck up our system. And our system's pretty out there for pharma. So here are some of the very specific things that are in the U.S. system that the U.S. is pushing into TPP that are not required, say, of the Global World Trade Organization. There is an agreement on patents called TRIPS, Trade-Related Intellectual Property. So what the U.S. is pushing goes beyond the WTO TRIPS rules, goes beyond what most countries actually have as their policies, and actually would impose, including on all the developing country partners in the TPP, the U.S. system that not only has a lengthy patent, but allows patenting of things like surgical procedures, which is one of the things the U.S. is pushing for the TPP. A lot of countries don't allow that. Or we have what's called data exclusivity. So, you know, folks may know, you've got a patent, you have a monopoly for a certain number of years to be able to sell whatever is under the patent for any price you want. In the U.S., actually, thanks to the WTO, it's a 20-year monopoly. It used to be 17 years before we were told to change our law, because pharma beat the consumer groups who beaten them in Congress by going to the WTO and getting the patent extended. So for 20 years, they have control. But now they're pushing for TPP to do what U.S. law does, which it guarantees that the data a generic company would need to get a medicine that's coming off the patent approved in time to actually have the generic done, that there's an extra exclusivity for the data you would need. So obviously you can't redo all the testing. It wouldn't be, it wouldn't be cheap. It wouldn't be a generic. The point of a generic is you just copy the formula of something that's been proved safe. You don't redo the drug tests. So this kind of data exclusivity. Another thing that's in there that is really outrageous, actually goes beyond U.S. law, is the ability to patent what's basically called patent evergreening, to get new 20-year patent on top of 20-year patent for tweaky little changes. So, you know, they come up with a blockbuster drug, the original doses, you have to take it twice a day, it's a 12-hour tablet. Then they come up with a 24-hour version. Like, that's a new formulation. No. It's a new benefit. No. But then under U.S. law, sometimes you can get it evergreen in a new 20 years. Under the TPP, they're trying to get that. So those are some of the really big, dangerous things in there. Practically, what does it mean? If you're Vietnam, if you're Malaysia, if you're any of the developing countries, or for that matter, you have the licensing systems under the formularies that basically do licensing agreements on price, you basically are crossways with your TPP obligations if you are New Zealand, Australia, Japan, Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei, Chile, Peru. And what would happen? Either the pharmaceutical companies could sue you directly for your cash out of your treasury, or you could be hit with trade sanctions on your actual trade until you basically give the big pharmaceutical companies new rights. Like, the last thing we should be doing is raising everyone else's medicine prices. Certainly we need to lower ours. It's really kind of sad because a lot of what's in the U.S. TPP proposal is contrary to what Obamacare is calling for. Next question. The TPP may not expire, but what would happen if the US or another country pulled out of the agreement? Okay, so the first point here is just to make clear the dire seriousness of something like a TPP. Unlike domestic law, an international agreement like TPP has no expiration date. So you know how, say, you do a controversial law and then it expires after 5 years, it has to be reauthorized. Or for that matter, the Congress can just change it. With TPP, it would have no expiration date. It's indefinitely the binding law. And for any change, a comma, every signatory would have to agree. So it's not like the U.S. can say, oh, that was a bad idea, let's fix that. So the question is, what would happen if a country got out? So legally, under any of these agreements, including NAFTA, on 6 months written notice, a country can walk. That has rarely happened. There is a wonderful example that can inspire us all about renegotiating our old NAFTA, in addition to staying off TPP, and that is Bolivia had a free trade agreement with Mexico, sort of like NAFTA between those countries. And when the more progressive government came in Bolivia, they said, we're not going to live with this indefinitely. This is outrageous. So we'll either get out of it and give you the 6 months notice, or let's sit down and fix it. And they rolled it back to really being a trade agreement. They got rid of all the crazy patent stuff and the crazy investor rights and the limits on financial regulation, and they made a trade agreement. There's a rare country that will do that, but there's some other countries that have. There is really no example of a country actually using the right on paper to pull. What they would suspect would happen, for instance, if the U.S. would walk away from the negotiations, is the negotiations would just stop. I mean, for all the other countries, what they're looking for is, Vietnam is looking for the U.S. jobs to be offshored and the investment that goes with it. Australia and New Zealand are looking for more agricultural exports. Australia, sugar; New Zealand, dairy. There are also some other offensive interests, but those are the really big ones. Some of the countries just kind of want the good housekeeping seal of approval, like the little country of Brunei. There are a variety of interests, I would say, that countries would just hang it up if the U.S. took a walk. But here's the bigger question. What do you think it would take for the U.S. to take a walk? So start organizing. Next question. Why would a country sign up for investor state? A question I ask myself every day, but there is an answer. Because I've asked some of the countries where I actually respect the government officials. So here is the story. A long time, every country believed the following to be true. They call it the grand bargain, in fact. If you sign up to these kind of lunatic investor protections, you make it really safe and secure for foreign investors to come to your country, and you even give them these rights with the investor state tribunals to sue you. Then they're going to come to your country with a lot of foreign direct investment, so-called FDI. They're going to bring their money to your country, and it's going to help you develop. And, objectively, for developing countries, they need investment. They need capital. And so that was the grand bargain. You take this poison pill, but in the end, you're going to get this great benefit. Now, here's the sad story. All of these different countries got either bullied by the World Bank, the IMF, into signing into these deals. They had governments that bought it, drank the Kool-Aid, or they were so desperate for FDI, even though it made them nervous, they decided to sign up. So you have all these countries that have these investment treaties. There are all these attacks happening on domestic laws. I mean, just recent ones. Egypt's post-revolution increase in the minimum wage being attacked by a British firm. The South Africa black empowerment ownership post-apartheid system being attacked by a bunch of Belgian and Italian investors. The Amazon pollution fines that Chevron's supposed to pay to Ecuador being stopped by one of these tribunals. I mean, crazy cases. And when you look at that, you say, okay, countries, what'd you get out of it? And in fact, now there's studies, including by the World Bank, that show there's no correlation, actually, between having these crazy agreements and having investor state and getting foreign investment. And in fact, countries like Brazil that have not a single investor state agreement and very narrowly limited bilateral investment treaties are, for instance, the biggest recipient of foreign direct investment in all of Latin America. There are a whole set of countries that have basically eschewed these agreements, who are the ones who actually are the biggest attractor of investments in their region. So the answer is that is why they got into it. It has not been proved true. And the wonderful news is countries like South Africa have just given notice that they're going to abrogate their treaties. You can either come renegotiate with them or they're getting out. and some countries have pulled on the investment arbitration bodies like ICSID at the World Bank. There is a bubbling starting up, and that's why we really all have to work very hard to make sure that while a bunch of countries are working to liberate themselves from that outrageous regime, TPP doesn't spread it, both thicker on the countries who've already gotten suckered into it before, because TPP's system on investor state is much worse than NAFTA. I mean, it deserves a NAFTA on steroids name. But also it would be spread to new countries that haven't basically been under the regime. So our first piece of business is do no further harm. And then I hope you'll think about joining us in an effort to figure out how to roll back those outrageous investor rights that exist. Next question. Does the TPP have anything to do with Monsanto and GMOs? If so, what is the connection? Well, there is a chapter in there that is called the Sanitary and Phytosanitary chapter, which does sound kind of unappetizing. Hint, hint, it's the food standards. And under those rules, you're basically not allowed to have a domestic food standard that is based on the precautionary principle, i.e. you have to have absolute scientific certainty that there's a harm. Things like consumer preference. So I want things labeled. I want to know what is GMO and what isn't, for instance. Or in the case of, say, how Europe deals with it, mandatory segregation of GMO and not GMO foods, a recognition that it's really uncertain what this stuff could do, certainly to the environment, who knows on human health, and let's let consumers make a choice. Let's put some limits on this unknown, unproved technology, unless we know it's safe. Let's not test it on a bunch of human guinea pigs, i.e. all of us. So that kind of regulation is forbidden in those food standards. And actually the place that I'm more worried about this, though it is the case that, say, New Zealand and some other countries have some good laws I'm very worried about. The U.S. has miserable laws. So as far as us being the loser in the TPP on this, not as a big a deal. Although, by the way, Monsanto is one of those 600 corporate trade advisors. They're probably on a couple of committees, Monsanto guys. But there's another agreement that just got launched called the Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement, TAFTA. This one directly rhymes with NAFTA, so accurately so. It is the European Union and the U.S. And actually, the companies behind it, who are called the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, are the biggest U.S. and EU companies who got together over the last 10 years and identified which of our best laws pissed them off the most. They call them trade irritants. Couldn't make this up. It's literally the list of all of the best: European food safety, consumer privacy, chemical regulations, the U.S. financial regulations post-crisis, which are better than the European ones, the U.S. insurance regulation system for consumers, stronger than the European system. They literally have gone through the whole list of different laws, and whichever side has the better one, they're targeting it to get sacked. And in there, GMOs, GMO segregation, GMO labeling, and GMO approvals are like ground zero of this corporate cabal. So we have on our website, not the Expose the TPP website, but on tradewatch.org, a bunch of information about this agreement. So if you're a GMO activist, as much as you should worry about what TPP does to other countries, the one that actually could really end the future, because, you know, Europe is the block there. Europe is the footprint that makes the space for all the developing countries, the smaller countries, the state of California, to try and push out. They're the big market that makes that a viable campaign. If we smoosh them through TAFTA on GMOs, it is a world of hurt. Next question. Dana via Twitter. Are there any speakers who will be going on the road to spread the word about the dangers of TPP? Funny you should mention that, because sitting right here handing me the questions is my lovely colleague, Elisa Simmons, and in Michigan, I suspect, is still my colleague, Lacey, yes, who are our two senior field organizers who will be all across the country talking about TPP and Fast Track. So if you go to the contact us part of exposethetpp.org and put in your information and ask for a connection. If we can't come and help spread the word, we also are partners in the Citizens Trade Campaign, citizenstrade.org. This is a national grassroots coalition of labor, environmental, consumer, family, farm, and other organizations, faith, civil rights groups all across the country, and they have staff in the last states. If you go to their website and click on your staff on the map, on your state on the map, it will list you up the staffer who's actually probably not, is driving distance from you. Not that we don't want to come out and visit you wherever you are, and we might. But if you need something quick, those folks are out there too. But get in touch with us, we can hook you up. If Fast Track isn't passed, what would be the process for the U.S. to decide whether or not to sign and implement the TPP? It's funny. What would be the process? Normal procedure, which is to say the shocking possibility of Congress actually getting to look at the text before it gets signed, getting to decide if it should be signed before it is signed and entered into. That would, just be following the Constitution, and being able to openly debate it, send back parts of it that I think need to be renegotiated as necessary, and actually pass it through a process that probably would never get to the situation of sending amendments back. And here's why. If the other countries didn't think the Congress was handcuffed by fast track, they would be much more likely to be paying attention to what a lot of members of Congress are saying. What a lot of members of Congress are saying is very useful, like Elizabeth Warren, rock star senator, expert on financial services. Last week was on the warpath against both TPP and TAFTA for rolling back our best financial regulations. You can actually see her go to Politico, the newspaper on Capitol Hill, and look at her on the front page, and there's a video of her giving her talk. Or they'd be listening to the 134 House members last year who said TPP was heading in the wrong direction. If there is no fast track, I suspect we'd have a very different kind of an agreement. And then we'd have normal consideration when we get to it. How would the TPP impact immigration? That's a really interesting question, and there are two parts to the answer. First of all, for everyone who's working on the immigration issue right now, this would be the moment to put down your hot beverage so you don't pour it on yourself. There's an entire chapter in TPP called Temporary Entry and Visas. Yes, TPP has a whole chapter of immigration policy. So if you thought this was a big roiling public debate in Congress, sadly it is going on in parallel in the TPP. And in fact, some past U.S. trade agreements granted guaranteed visas, typically biased towards skilled workers, didn't deal with the kinds of issues of folks who are already here or unskilled workers. There's a big demand by a block of countries actually to allow work permits, visas, for low-skill workers who could be hired on contract, brought in at the wage levels of their developing country where the contract is made, and used to here drive down wages. So if you're working in the building trades, construction, etc., this is not a good system. It's a way to sort of undermine labor rights. The second piece about immigration, though, is that the TPP is slated to have the same kind of agriculture rules that were in NAFTA. So for countries like Vietnam, where there's still a lot of people living on the farm, living on the countryside, on their farms, basically as peasant farmers, this would mean having to accept large amounts of subsidized, dumped commodities from the other TPP countries, several of whom are huge agribusiness exporters. So with that in mind, you'd have another immigration problem, which is you just have a lot of displaced people. So for instance, after NAFTA, immigration to the U.S. increased 60% as soon as the corn tariffs went down. We started dumping corn on Mexico. After the CAFTA, there was a huge wave of Central American immigrants after U.S. dumped food products, ended up wiping people out of their own farms. It just got impossible. You lost the farm, literally. And so as far as displacement within the TPP and the cause of immigration, I have often said that bad trade agreements are like the supply side of an immigration crisis. We have time for one more question, I am told, and it is, this is so huge, it seems like it would be impossible to stop. What can I really do to make a difference? Okay, so here's the thing about being so huge. Compartmentalize. It's like the elephant thing. You know the old story about, depending on what part of the elephant you grab, could be like a rope, you got the tail. Could be like a hose, you got the trunk. Could be like a wall, you got the guts. Could be like a tree trunk, you got a leg. The TPP is the elephant of trade agreements. Whichever part makes you most crazy, gets your friends activated, gets the word out, you don't have to describe the whole damn elephant. So, for instance, for a friend who is on Medicare, then get with your friends about what this means for the program that is very important to you. For our friend who asked about immigration, if you're up to your ears in that fight, dang, you don't want this being done through the back door of a trade agreement with a bunch of corporations in there. You want it done in public. For folks who asked about investor state, if that's a thing that floats your boat, it's one of the things that makes me most nuts about TPP, then get the word out on that. Because what we need to do is really get the word out on any part of this. So if you go to exposethetpp.org, you'll see their fact sheets that are very clean and simple on each of these different issues. You don't need to learn all of it. You don't even need to print all of them. Figure out which one or two of them really make you nuts and that you think would actually activate and motivate your friends and family. That's the piece of TPP. Could be the internet freedom issue. Whole thing is so broad and damaging, you can pick the piece that works. So, number one, you don't have to know the whole thing. It's not so big. Number two, and this is where I'm going to end, we have done it before. So, Free Trade Area of the Americas, the FTAA. This was the last NAFTA on steroids, multi-country craziness, and it was launched right after NAFTA. And those of us who were around back then were told, get out of the way. This is inevitable. This is done. This is going to happen. Get ready to have it signed. It's going to be in effect in 2005. And actually in 2005, we just had a big party because, well, it was totally derailed because of civil society campaigning all through the Americas and in the Caribbean. Same thing with the multilateral agreement on investment. We were just told, that's it, all the corporations want to get out of the way. Or, everyone remembers the big protests in Seattle against the WTO? Well, you've got, after all of that fighting, after 10 years of trying, that expansion of WTO is tanked, done totally by people power. Now, how you can do it, that's where you need to go back and to expose the TPP. Because as well as having the information you need, it gives you all kinds of good action ideas, as well as how to connect with people in your community. We can do this. We are connected to people around the world in all these other countries who are doing this, and working together, we're going to do it again. And then I'll look forward to actually the live chat where we'll have the celebration. But I bet we'll be talking a lot between now and then, because we're going to have to actually fight very hard to get the word out, to get our members of Congress held accountable, to vote against fast track, to say no to this TPP, and it's going to be an extended fight. So look forward to talking to all of you again soon. Thank you for your interest. Please pass on the word about exposetpp.org. We need to build a